Welcome to the U2 conference. We're chatting with Pádraig Tuama, poet, theologian, and peace worker, who directed Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. Pádraig's book, In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World, is a work of memoir, story, poetry, and encouragement to say hello to new possibilities for hope, belonging, and joy. First published in 2015 in Ireland, it's now available in the U.S. from Broadleaf Books. U2's The Edge calls Pádraig a kindred artist whose skills as a poet are honed for the purpose of the common good. I'm your host, Scott Calhoun, and I talked with Pádraig on March 21st, 2021 as a Facebook Live event for the U2 conference. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy our conversation. How's your week been with the St. Patrick's Day festivities?
There was none. Yeah. We're in pretty strict lockdown here. So there was no parades. All the pubs are closed. All cafes are closed. And have been really since about November time, with a brief respite at Christmas. So there was nothing. It's the third time in 20 years that the St. Patrick's Day parade has been cancelled. Last year, obviously, as well. And then in 2001 as well, for foot and mouth disease, when that was there.
Yeah. Well, I kind of consider this our Patrick's Day right now, at least for the YouTube conference. Thank you. We'll make another way. Great. Which does seem to be sort of a theme running through so many of your beautiful pieces of there's always another way of looking at the matter. But I'll just like to say a few words, and then maybe you can tell us a few more personal stories about how it's come to be that we have a poet and a theologian and a peace worker with us. But many of you, I think, have heard Pádraig on Being or various radio programs, and I've been aware of him for some years now. But it's nice to actually see him and have him here in person. But Pádraig's work centers around the themes of language and power in conflict and religion. He's worked with many groups. He likes to do group work, and he uses the power of story to work through conflicts and relationships so that they can be healed and unified to the best of our ability here on earth. He's used poetry in group discussion and lectures, and his work is marked with lyricism, but also pragmatism. From 2014 to 2019, he was the leader of the Corrymeela community, which is Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community, which I believe was started in 1965.
Yeah.
So it goes back quite a ways. Pádraig does appear on the Poetry Unbound podcast with the On Being Studios. In 2019, he was named Theologian in Residence for that platform. He's told stories in various contexts on the Moth, and with his partner Paul Doran, he's created this event. Sounds very interesting. I'd like to catch this sometime. But it's called 10 times 9, which is a storytelling event where I take it that maybe regular folk like me would have a chance to get up and tell a story.
Folk just like you.
Just like me. Oh, well, maybe next year.
We have one this Wednesday, actually. They're on Zoom. So you can join in from anywhere.
Let's share that link a little bit later for others maybe to also be there. So that's wonderful. So it seems like story has been storytelling has been integral and life-giving and part of your present and future, I take it, for quite a while. Yeah. Well, your work is in multiple genres. I know you write in the areas of theology, poetry, prose. It was in 2018, I was in Belfast, and we had just wrapped up our U2 conference. Actually, we had the lovely Steve Stockman hosted us at Fitzroy for a few days, and the day after that,
my wife,
no surprise there. We made our way to the John Hewitt also for a wonderful closing evening, and then the next day I found myself in No Alibis bookstore there, and thousands of books there. And I came upon something guided me to the poetry section, and then there were 2 copies there of Sorry for Your Troubles, and I bought both, and I brought one home for a friend, and I kept one for myself. But that was my sort of introduction, maybe in a hard copy form, to your work, and enjoyed that quite a lot. I think it was Malcolm Geit who first sort of put me on to you several years ago, but But it happened for me in Belfast that I was able to be in that bookstore and purchase your work. And so thankful for that. So it's so nice to have you 3 years later now here with us. This is it's been, I think, a big year for you already. I've gathered you're releasing work left and right 24/7. But this is a week where your book In the Shelter comes to the U.S. through Broadleaf Books, and I know it'll be released later this week, I think on the 25th. Yeah. But we'd like to hear about that. But what caught my eye, and I think what sort of makes a bit of sense for the U2 conference to sort of cross paths here with you is that there's this wonderful endorsement from The Edge where Pádraig Tuama is a kindred artist. His skills as a poet are honed for the purpose of the common good. And we'd love to hear more about that a little bit later on this hour. But first, could you just tell us a little bit about why is it, or how is it perhaps, that you've become three things that I think a lot of people might find joyful and also a bit frustrating at the same time: a poet, a theologian, and a peace worker?
Well, for me, they all center around language. And Scott, thanks very much for having me here, and thanks for anybody who's listening in or watching in. Like poetry, conflict, and theology all center around language. How do we use language for the purpose of creativity? How do we use language for the purpose of destruction? And how do we use language for the purpose of meaning making? And theology at its heart is a desire to tell some kind of story that people hope carries meaning in it for more than just one person. And so within the context of all three of those, they involve language acts. And language acts about things that can have a real impact through the heart, through safety or its lack, as well as through meaning. So it makes a lot of sense to me that poetry, theology, and conflict would sit together in the one place. But I don't think that's unusual, though. I think a lot of people with an interest in poetry also have interest in other ways in which language pays attention to the world. And poetry in lyricism, too, through songs, you know.
Sure. Yeah. When did do you remember a time in your life when you were encountering one of these three things that it clicked for you that you would like to follow in the steps of a poet or a peace worker or a theologian?
Well, I mean, none of those were options when I was thinking about what careers to have as a young fella. So they all would definitely have been considered to be luxuries, the idea, maybe not a peace worker, but certainly theologians and being a poet, those would never have been imaginable as a career path. But yet they were deep desires. So when I got to go to university, and I didn't start university till I was 27, I went to study theology because I didn't imagine it would make me much money, but I knew that it would address some serious questions that I had. I wanted to study in a way where questions to do with religion were being held in the light of scholarship. I wanted to not just be around places of devotion. I wanted to be in places where I could ask very serious questions about religion. Do I believe it? Do I want to believe it? Do you have to believe it? What about all these claims that religion has about miracles? Are those literal? I mean, I was brought up in a devout home, but a devout home that also had devotion to science. So I had never had any instance in my life ever of taking, the creation myths of the Bible in any way literally. That was never the imagination, even in a very devout time. But still, I wanted to think about what are artistic ways to look at these texts. So I suppose I had known for a very long time that poetry and religion were serious questions that I had. And I suppose the older I got, the more I realized those questions aren't going away. I needed to make money along the way, but I also needed to find a way to explore these questions in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Who are some of the poets that brought you along to this point or gave you the inspiration to keep going?
So the school curriculum for my secondary school was very weighted towards Patrick Kavanagh, an English language poet from County Monaghan. It's in Ulster County, it's just on the border. And he hated where he was from. He has a poem called Shan Caduff, meaning old black hills. And one of the lines in it says, "Who owns them dark hills? A poet? By God, he must be poor." And he despised where he was from and lived quite a miserable life and wrote really miserable poems. And I hated him in my teenage years. But I suppose I had teachers who said to me, well, hate him with intelligence. Tell us why you hate him. Read him carefully and then say why you reject him. So, and now, I mean, I think I just needed to be older before I could love him. And then Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill is another poet, Irish language poet. She was born in England, actually, to Irish-speaking parents, and then was sent to live with an aunt, I think, when she was 6, and moved back and forth between Tipperary and West Kerry. And she only writes in Irish. And she came to visit our class when I was 12 or 13. And she swept into the classroom speaking in Irish about poems she'd written in Irish. She was highlighting a mistake that had been made in the translation of a poem into English by somebody else. And I just thought she was magnificent. It had never occurred to me that you could be so brave and courageous about language, and Irish language and poetry. She was part of a kind of a revival of Irish language poetry where they were writing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but in Irish. In a way that most of the Irish language poems we'd have had in school were about national concerns and political concerns and maybe some religious devotions poem in Irish. But her stuff was about language for sure, but also about relationships and about the breakdown of family relationships and sex and all kinds of things. She's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that there's a certain braveness or bravery that you found in poetry and in language. Writ large in many ways. And
when
can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, Marie Howe has a poem called The Meadow. She's an American poet, and the poem finishes off by saying, I'm going to misquote it slightly, but the poem finishes off by saying, "Beloved, bedeviled, even now the words lie dormant on your tongue, and you must know that tangled among them and terribly new is the sentence that will change your life." And that, I think, is the invitation to the faculty of language. Poetry is just something we do with language, but the question is what are we doing with language in the poem? How are we shaping something of a protest or of a cry or of a joyous shout for the beauty of the world or a lament for the terror of the world? How are we doing that with language that feels fresh, even though you might be describing something that feels chaotic? I think we all have moments in our life when, via a lyric of a song or via a poem that we've read, or even something you hear on the radio, you just can't get it out of your head because it strikes true at the gut of you. And that, I think, is the work of art in us. Yeah, right. It gives us the courage. It gives us maybe a new way to look at things that we've already been looking at for so long. But it's interesting. And words reach out from the page too and kind of say you're not alone, and that's a great joy. Yeah, can you talk some more about the loneliness factor, perhaps in your own journey to the point where you're at Corrymeela and you're helping others? Well, it's a space, I think, to sort of work through some loneliness and find peace together with others, isn't it? But how did that happen for you, such that you end up picking the topic of loneliness, which is maybe a kind of a heavy topic, to dwell on, to focus on, and try to work that out with others? Well, I mean, I think the question of who we are in groups is often the question that's explored through the lens of conflict and, politics and community work. Okay. But who we are in groups is profoundly related to who we are when we're by ourselves. And I think that the inner life in that way is always going to have an impact on the outer life, the private life and the public life, but also the deeply personal life, the unbroadcasted life, the way that everybody has conversations with himself. And hopefully everybody will have times when they come in contact with their own loneliness. I don't think you can have an adult life that doesn't have some form of relationship with the question about what it means to pay attention to times, to who you are when you're alone. I'm not idealistic about loneliness. Loneliness can kill. And we know in the last year that isolation has been a terrible thing. And I think a certain amount of feeling a bit alone can be a good thing for a person in growing up. But we know that that can be a cancer when it doesn't go away. And that can cause deterioration of the body and deterioration of the heart and the imagination too. So, and I think paying attention to the ways within which the chaos of our own isolation, as well as the chaos of our own conflict when we're in groups, who are we in those moments? And how can we take wisdom from there and start to practice something better? That for me is why the question of who we are when we're alone is profoundly related to the question of who we are when we're together.
How is that sort of drawn you towards different artists as well, those big themes of who we are when we're alone, but also when we're in community? We've talked a little bit about poetry in your life, but could you also talk about music? And I know you're in a place where I think, sort of geographically, where many of us watching would say is a really rich tradition of music heritage. So can you speak a little bit about what you grew up with and what's stuck with you and what you hang on to even today for inspiration?
Yeah, I'm from a musical family, and so there was always a fair amount of traditional music in the house, which is lovely. So my older sister plays the fiddle and the tin whistle and the guitar and the bagpipes, and my older brother is a fine whistle player and piano, and then I picked up the guitar when I was 11 and have played ever since. And then the three younger ones, there's 6 offspring in the family, they're all musical too. So partly music was just always there. I remember in the same year, like all the other lads in my school or in my class, it felt like they'd all got their band that they loved, and I didn't really have that. I used to pretend I did. My brother liked Supertramp and the Doors, so I started to write those in my homework journal. I'd never listened to Supertramp or the Doors, but I thought nobody else knows them either, so it'll seem like I belong to a club.
Yeah.
But I remember when I heard the Waterboys for the first time, just thinking, oh, yes, there was something of the wild abandon, I think, of the Waterboys, together with Mike Scott's voice and together with something that did very definitely sound like a hybrid Irish-Scottish sound, together with rock, that I loved. And then on the Late Late Show on RTE one Friday night, I caught about a minute and a half of a woman, Tanisha Tickerham, singing a song, playing it on the guitar and being accompanied by a string quartet. And I immediately thought, who is she? And I missed the announcement as to who the name was. I phoned my friend up who'd been watching, Cahill, and said to him, who was that just playing on RTE? And he said, oh, that's Tanisha Tickerham. And I said, she is who I'm going to follow. And he said to me, that's gay. And with reflection, I can go, yeah, I definitely do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's moments like that where I don't even know why. It's a mixture of energy and poetry, I suppose, and some kind of musicality where it strikes you while you're desperately looking around. Through Tanisha Tickerham, I found my way to Leonard Cohen. She is a big fan of his, and I continued then to listen to all of his albums and buy them and read all his lyrics as well as his own poetry. And I think Leonard Cohen is probably one of the artists whose work I admire most, because the older he got, the more pure I think his lyrics became. And pure, I don't mean in a Puritan way, but pure in the sense of that he continued to circle around the questions of his own longing, and to do that with increasing courage and with increasing vulnerability.
Yeah, wonderful.
There's loads of music. I mean, I continue to listen to a lot of Irish traditional music. So I love Teda. They're magnificent. I think Zoe Conway is brilliant. I love Mary Ann Kennedy from Scotland, a traditional Scottish singer. So Yeah, Irish traditional music is alive and well, and Scottish traditional music, and the scene is magnificent and wonderful. So I love listening to the Gloaming, and yeah, there's
Yeah.
loads out there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Well, we have. I just wanted to go over here to the comments, and a lot of people are showing up and saying hello. I don't think you can see these, but
No, I
we
can't.
have I have a, yeah, and I'd like to take some questions a little bit later. So if you do have a question for Pádraig, please just drop that into the comments section. I'll read that out. But a lot of love, a lot of hellos so far. So that's
Lovely.
good to hear. Could you talk a little bit about Corrymeela, just in the sense of how you ended up there and how you ended up as a leader for 5 years, I believe?
Yeah. Corrymeela is a peace and reconciliation organization, started, as you mentioned, in 1965. And I came to Corrymeela for a weekend retreat in 2003. I mean, Corrymeela's main work really is exploring the questions of peace in the context of British-Irish relationships. The Corrymeela Centre is on the very north coast of County Antrim in Ballycastle. So that's a huge amount of the work. But along the way, Corrymeela has also had a very courageous and powerful witness about other elements of inclusion and dialogue. And so since 1980, Corrymeela has been a brave and courageous and powerful witness to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender inclusion. So in 2003, a friend of mine said, "Do you want to go on a retreat up in Corrymeela?" I'd never heard of it, but she said it's the only place in Ireland where if you're gay, you can go and talk about religion and talk about sexuality in a way where you're not going to be divorced from either. So I had never even thought that such a thing was possible in Ireland. So I went along, and really from then just stayed involved. Somebody said, "Oh, do you want to volunteer here, or do you want to get involved with this? You write some poetry, don't you? Do you want to come along to some storytelling workshops that are happening for people who survived the Troubles, and then respond as kind of artist in residence?" So from 2005 really to 2014, I, on a freelance basis and often as a volunteer, unpaid, was doing huge amounts of work with Corrymeela as poet in residence or as group facilitator, looking at ways within which people who had different religious points of view too could not agree with one another, because peace isn't built on people agreeing with each other. Peace is built on people being able to maintain their differences and even argue, but do that without recourse to threat or violence. And that really electrified me as the possibility, again, because it's language. You get people in a room saying the kind of things to each other that you never thought people would be able to say to each other, and hearing it and responding, and you keep on wondering what's going to happen next. So simply from a kind of a story point of view, it's not predictable. When people take courageous steps towards each other, something very unpredictable happens. Violence, in a certain sense, is very predictable. People will continue to escalate violence until one side escalates it to the annihilation of the other. And in that way, it's not very predictable, or it is very predictable. But peace, I think, is always tentative, is always made anew each time, is a creative act. And so that inspired the poet in me, as well as the Irish person who had always grown up with an awareness of the fact that we were speaking the English language. I mean, I love the Irish language, but you know, majority of everything is that happens in Ireland is in English. And so I suppose I'd grown up with a sensibility of British conflict in Ireland, and the practice of Corrymeela inspired me to think about creative responses to that rather than just revengeful ones.
What tended to be the really effective, in your opinion, while you were there seeing this work and being a part of this work, what was the effective tool, if you will, maybe with language or story that allowed that work to be successful, and maybe which you've carried with you to this day?
Yeah. Well, there's two things that would strike me. The first of which is storytelling. When you get people in the room who are used to telling stories about the other, but perhaps not often hearing them from each other, and they have the opportunity to speak with each other, something very powerful can happen. When people listen to another point of view, when people realize that the story I've told about you actually has been inaccurate and actually has only been serving my own sectarianism, or where somebody says, I have been sectarian and I have thought about you in a way where you probably wouldn't recognize your story of yourself because I've told my version of your story. And then also where people are being plainly hateful towards each other and are making steps towards each other to say, I think I want to change. That is fascinating to see. And those are small pockets about human relationship. And human relationship is only one element of peace. You need policy, you need changed history curriculums in places that have been impacted by empire or other supremacies. And so I don't think that just because people come to a retreat center and have a lovely time with each other, that's the solving of it all. But without human relationship, politicians who need to do the hard work of engaging with each other probably won't be able to do very much if they don't have some skills of human relationship. So while I don't think it's everything, I also think that it is something profoundly necessary. We have been caught up in cycles and cycles where politicians in the north of Ireland seem to be fundamentally opposed to communicating with each other in public. We had a first and deputy first minister who never shook hands in public. And, because I think the idea is if I'm seen to be engaging by shaking hands with this other person, somehow I'll be seen to endorse them. And that I think was a failure of human communication and human encounter. So that's the first thing. I think story, when people can be disrupted by each other's stories. And when I hear another story, I'm changed. I mightn't like it. I mightn't even agree with it. I mightn't even agree with all of it. But something powerful happens, especially if people can tell their story in a way that isn't for broadcast on Twitter or broadcast for a party political purpose, but for communicating with pain and vulnerability, the story of your life. That is a transformative experience. I don't know what we're going to be transformed into, but it is a muscular and painful and powerful thing. And the second thing, the story is one. The second one is linked to that, to story as well. But I do think it is about the stories we're told in public, particularly through history classes in school and particularly through religion. And so what I think is we need a transformed approach to the question of education. When I moved to Belfast, I was reading a book about the Troubles. And in the context of the book, the writer said, everything was fine until 1968 when the Catholics turned to terrorism. And I closed the book. I just thought, my God, that's a failure of imagination of story when it comes to understanding the circumstances that were present in the 60s, from partition up to the 60s, from the famine to the 60s, from the incorporation of Ireland into this thing called the United Kingdom up to the 1960s, that totally undid that. And what I think we need, and what peace needs, I think, is a reformation really in the questions of the stories that are told in public. And in public, that's school, that's the stories that governments tell, that's the story that formal big organizations like churches tell about identity and nationhood too. So those are the two things that strike me. And that's why I'm so interested in power, is because often stories are told in a way where they garner power, and we need to have a power analysis.
Thank you. Right. Well, you keep coming back to the role of language and all that.
Sure.
Either at the personal level, but at the policy level.
I don't see a difference. Yeah.
No.
The personal is the political.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see this power working out with language and storytelling, and if I can bring up U2 a little bit in the music that you're certainly aware of, and is certainly kind of part of the reason why we've gathered in this space, but you've mentioned some of your, the artists that you hold a little closer to you and have been more useful and meaningful and special for you. But I can't get over the fact that here we have The Edge endorsing your book, and there must be some relationship there. And would you just talk a little bit about how U2 came onto your radar and what you see their work as that would connect with what your work is?
Yeah. I mean, I see that, I'm 45, so for a person my age, I think it was almost impossible to grow up without U2, in the sense of that they were defining an imagination of Irishness. They were defining an imagination of a transatlantic connection. And during a time when often that transatlantic connection had been about poor Irish people or unemployed Irish people moving elsewhere, England, Australia, the United States, Canada, for work. And so there was a way within which a public and global success story of U2 was kind of unbelievable to think, and they're Irish. Like, my God, are we capable of that? I know, I mean, I always find Americans very foreign when they have children who kind of believe that they can do anything. I didn't believe I could do anything when I was a child. And that was considered to be the way to be a proper child, was to have very little expectation on yourself. Do well in your exams, but don't be above your station. And seeing the success of U2 has always been phenomenal. And, you know, their work in Sunday Bloody Sunday, their work in paying attention to questions to do with civil rights, their curiosity previously as well as contemporarily in terms of the shows of their gigs, where they showcase causes of goodwill, and they showcase questions about who is it that's doing courageous work locally, paying attention to the RED campaign in terms of campaigning about access to HIV medications in places where those had been denied, not because they weren't available, but where there was policy in the way. I think U2 have done some extraordinary work outside of the realm of art, but in the way of saying, what is stopping you, apart from ego and stubbornness, from being around to provide ways where people who could easily get access to medications that are in existence are being prevented to? Why don't we change that? So I think U2's work has often, for me, spanned the gap between the personal and the political. And they get criticized for that as well as praised for that. And I think that's always going to be the chasm that you hold yourself across when you're trying to make some kind of link between your private art and something that you hope is a public good. I mean, so I came across U2 a few years back through some connections, and the Edge was really interested in hearing more about peace and reconciliation. Within a couple of minutes of meeting him, we were talking about Presbyterianism and religion and the question of politics. And he said, "Oh, I'd like to come and see Corrymeela." And so we stayed in touch, and then he has shown great interest and support in the practice of what reconciliation looks like contemporarily.
Right on. Thank you. Wow. Well, it's nice to hear so much about how we've gotten up to this point, and I appreciate you working through some of those big ideas a little bit. Could we get real specific now and just talk about your book here, In the Shelter?
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. It's a wonderful book. I enjoyed it immensely. I was able to read through it last week, and so many have endorsed it and praised it, and I can't add much else to those. I have to agree with all that, but I really found it to be provocative in a kindly provocative, I should say, but still provocative, and in just encouraging me, and I think any reader will pick up on this, of the power of saying hello, and the power of being open to a moment or a presence in front of you. And what you do, I think, so nicely is keep sort of turning whatever it is that you're gazing at the moment. And you work through so many moments in your life, but you're looking at all the possibilities that moment has. And I appreciate that. Thank you for your words that way.
Thanks, Scott.
Would you be kind enough to read us a passage that you think would
sure.
be good for this?
You had prepped me for this. So
yes.
I've got a passage right from the start of the book, actually. In some ways, this is it's partly a memoir, but it's a memoir of stories from cities and stories from books, and stories from books that have broken me, and hopefully stories from books that can kind of heal me a bit too. So here's an excerpt from a city. Another time, in another city, I was walking at night time. It was Melbourne, a city that was my home for 4 years. It was dark, and as I was walking toward Flinders Street train station, I saw a man who seemed distressed. I stopped to ask if he wanted directions, and as he replied, it was clear that he was deaf. I owned a sign language dictionary and had perused it for years, so I was delighted to practice my limited knowledge. He told me he was French and had only arrived in the city that day. I spelt IRISH, and he asked me how I knew sign language, and I got lost in the spelling. He was looking for the train station, and I said to come with me. We walked, and I stumbled through his fluent language. He was happy to have met someone who could speak a few words of his language, and I was delighted to have the happy chance to talk. He was pure charm. At one point, I was trying to say something in sign, and he laughed and did an imitation of my cumbersome signing. When we said goodbye at the train station, he grabbed both of my slow hands in his, and I felt his warmth and fluency, and we shared a joy of being human in the city. Earlier on that night, I'd been walking around the city, and someone had come up to me and asked if I knew the truth of Jesus Christ. I told him I wasn't interested, but he must have reckoned that a refusal is an engagement, so he persisted. I even told him that I had a Bible in my bag, and that on good days I tried to read it, and he asked me whether I had the proper translation of the Bible in my bag. He asked me to say a prayer with him, but I wouldn't. I've lied enough in my life. The reason I was walking the city late at night was because only 2 days before I'd received a phone call from my mother. We always spoke on a Sunday night. It was winter in Melbourne, so there was a 9-hour difference between Ireland and Australia. My mother's phone call came at the wrong time. My childhood best friend was dead, she told me, dead from suicide, and then there was nothing else to say. Nothing else. He'd taken his life and his sadness and his burdens and his body and hung them all in a place where we used to play. So I'd done the only thing I knew how to do. I went to the city and I walked in the city. At one point I walked into a bookshop and found The Lord of the Rings, a book I love. I turned to the place where Gandalf is dead. The bereaved companions have found their way to Lothlorien, and on the first night they hear the others sing laments for the wizard. The laments are in Elvish, and when some ask Legolas, the elf, to translate, he refuses, saying that the grief was too near, a matter for tears and not yet for song. I read it over and over and over, standing at a bookshelf, holding a heavy book, in a shop in the middle of the city. Hello to the need for shelter. Hello to the stories that shelter us.
Thank you so much. Why'd you pick that passage for us?
Well, because it's narrative, and I think it shows an overlap of language and religion and conflict. I have a deaf auntie, and I mean, so I've grown up around a lot of deaf people, and was always curious about the language. And so my auntie Mary had given me a sheet that had the spelling, the finger spelling on it, and then I had later on gotten a sign language dictionary and used to read through it. So, I mean, I'm not in any way a speaker of sign. I can do, I suppose, what you call sign-supported English. I know 500 or 600 signs, and then I can spell out things. So it's not in any way the brilliance of that language. But, but there is that love of language. There's a lovely serendipity too, because your man, whose name I never got, was French, and Irish Sign Language is based on French Sign Language. And so when I started to sign, because Australian Sign Language is totally different, when I started to sign to him, it wasn't just that I knew some sign, it's that I knew a sign that was very close to his sign. There was just such a lovely, unexpected sense of connection. And it's in the city. And then the question about religion, some Egypt that night, while I was wandering around in terrible grief, was saying, do you want to know the truth of Jesus Christ? My God, no, of course I don't. And anybody with half a heart would have seen, bloody hell, that fella's distressed, because I was distressed. I was at the edge of myself. My childhood best friend was dead. And, but yet your man kept on trying to force religion. And so I suppose that small text of the book is a way within which the various concerns and interests of my life all coalesced, not as artistic abstractions, but as things that occur in a real life.
Right. Yeah, very concrete. Yeah, thank you. And this, I think you've offered us in that passage, but in the whole book, time after time, page after page, of very, very concrete, specific, real moments for you that I think transfer really well
Thanks.
to readers who are, you're kind of mapping out the whole human experience, every other page. So wherever you're at, I think personally,
That's kind, yeah.
you can
I'll
feel
tell you part of the reason why I'm interested in story is because I'm shit at philosophy. When I did my undergrad, I had to do a whole variety of modules in philosophy, and I was terrible at it. I have no brain for abstractions. So when I had to write essays about the essence of the being of the oneness or the Trinitarianness, it just made absolutely no sense. So I decided as soon as I was able to finish with writing any philosophical papers that I was only going to stick with story. So
yeah.
that's been my attitude ever since.
Right. Well, good for you. Thank you. I'm glad you did stick with that. It doesn't quite ring true until you've actually wrestled with it in person or in the concrete world. Doesn't that's the value there of that, I think, specific moment. But this is a moment where the book is coming to the United States, and I know you're very aware of the moments that we've been going through over here. What do you hope? I know that you wrote this book 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, or it came out 5 years ago, and I appreciated your postscript there and your words, the words that you shared from Frederick Douglass, even. But could you say a little bit about what you would hope an American reader might receive from the book now?
Well, it always interests me how close Christian religion is to the surface of an American politic, which isn't to say that everybody in America is religious, but it is to say that, the question as to whether the person who's being elected for president does or doesn't go to a religious service is very much to the fore. That isn't the case even in Ireland anymore, and certainly in loads of places around Europe. And so the public power of religious affiliation in the United States is close to the surface. And while I have no imagination that everybody is interested in theology, I think in a place where religion is a public power, everybody is affected by it, because what a person makes the Bible say, and I say that specifically because that's an active interpretation, what a person makes the Bible say can have devastating impact on somebody who's suddenly excluded because of that. So if somebody says, biblical marriage is only between one man and one woman, suddenly that isn't a religious statement. That is depending as to who's saying it, that's a public and political statement. And I mean, having studied the Bible, there isn't one single biblical marriage that I'd ever want to be part of. My God, even if I was a heterosexual, my God, the Bible is no advertiser for the question about what marriage should look like. And I don't think that was the anxiety of the Bible. I think the Bible was hugely interested in the question of population survival. So therefore, loads of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament texts, rightly so, are profoundly interested in, can we have the babies? Can we make the babies? Make the babies. Because they were a struggling, tiny population of people surrounded by people they thought were their enemies. And so that's a serious question to pay attention to those. And those are public and political. And I suppose the invitation from this book, and that I think might be beneficial for any Americans, and I'm aware of the audacity of that, is to think about what does it mean to tell the truth about the stories that shape us. And those truths have to be inconvenient. You mentioned the bit in the final chapter, the new chapter about Frederick Douglass. There's loads of public quotation about when Frederick Douglass came to Ireland in 1845, just at the beginning of the famine, and his words of praise. My God, he was filled with words of praise for the Irish. And there's people now suggesting, whether in Dublin or Belfast, statues of Frederick Douglass should go up. And most of those statues will go up to the Frederick Douglass who said lovely things about the Irish in 1845. What is ignored is what Frederick Douglass said about the Irish in 1853, 8 years later, after hundreds of thousands of Irish people had landed on the shores of the United States. He was filled with castigation and critique for the Irish, because he said when the Irish arrived in America, they who are the friend of the oppressed everywhere at home became the oppressors when they landed in the States. And that for me is part of the inconvenience of telling the truth. And I think that needs to be told in a way where we tell the difficult stories about ourselves to ourselves. And that, I think, is a human enterprise. And that, I think, is something that I would hope that people in positions of power could choose to do rather than having it forced upon us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Would you take a couple of questions?
Sure.
Could I throw a few at you here?
I'll take some fortifying tea beforehand.
Yeah. Right. Well, here's one from Angela, thanking you for your erasure poem on the Vatican Statement. Would you like to speak a little? Can you speak on how your reflections on language, theology, and love brought that about?
Well, thanks, Angela. For people who don't know, an erasure poem is where you take a body of text and you fade out most of the words except for a few, and you kind of create a found poem, an unexpected poem there. And the Vatican came out with a statement just earlier on this week, maybe on Monday or something like that, about how same-sex unions are not going to be blessed in the church. And partly the statement was so inane because it's not like anybody thought the Vatican was going to bless them. You know, it felt like a way of punishing the imagination of some people that the church could be different. But what was said in there was nothing new. And I thought it came across with a tone and a spirit of aggression. And I am far from any kind of practice in the Catholic Church. I don't kind of try to define myself as a religious person, even though religion is one of the biggest questions of my life. And I will continue to circle around God, like Rilke said, for all of my life, I think. But I think certitude is often very violent. And so I feel so safe from that kind of bullshit that came out from the Vatican that I wanted to do something creative in response to it. And I think the Vatican has often said extraordinary things, like when you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, when it speaks about prayer coming from the heart, and the heart is the place of the psyche and the encounter and the place where you meet God. What I know is that the Vatican is capable of the kind of language that draws people towards each other across barriers. And here I saw language being used to erect barriers, and that seemed to be a complete waste of language. So I thought, well, I'm going to see what I can create from the rubble of this language. So that's where the erasure poem came from. I skipped yoga last Tuesday morning in order to be able to do it.
Did you now? Oh. Are you a week behind now, or did you pick it up the next day? Yeah. Well, that's a real specific, kind of recent moment. And thank you for that answer. Here's another question, is a little bit more, dare I say, philosophical. I know, given your comments, but no, it's from Matt, and he's interested in the whole idea of abstraction. Can you expand on your take on that topic, Pádraig? Matt, I'm not sure perhaps what that is referring to in our conversation, but I have a sense that I think a couple others here are curious, as I am too, about how do you work, kind of in those two realms of the conceptual and the concrete. I don't think there's a poet out there probably who, can't sometimes be out there in the abstract world. Is that true? Does that work for you?
Well,
is that true?
Language is profoundly concrete in the sense of that you're shaping words, and of the, 20,000 words that a person speaking the English language, an adult, might have accessible to them, you choose this one to start off this line. And so that is profoundly concrete. I suppose abstraction for me often has the imagination that it can speak to the universal. And I don't really believe in the universal. I believe that there are different kinds of people doing different kinds of things. And I think to speak to the particular is not the pathway to speaking to the universal. But to speak to the particular can sometimes say, well, here's what this looks like in the context of this experience. And that forms a template for discussion then, and for disagreement. I've been reading the French philosopher Hélène Cixous lately. She's still alive. She's in her 90s. She's quite extraordinary. And she writes in theater and poetry and fiction and philosophy and all kinds of things. She's quite amazing. when she's reflecting on European philosophy having been dominated particularly by European men, and she quotes a long sentence by a particular philosopher, and then she says at the end, "I wonder did his hand hurt after he wrote that long sentence, and was he right-handed or left-handed?" And this is why I love Hélène Cixous, is because she's so interested in the question of embodiment. Rather than just going into whatever the philosopher said that was an abstraction, she goes into the particular of the question of who was the person whose hand wrote this? Did their hand hurt? And this isn't just clever. It is asking the serious question of embodied pain in the context of language that sometimes doesn't know how to speak to pain. And so I'm always interested in, when we're dealing with something that is concrete, to use concrete examples. That is not to say that I think everybody should be doing that. I am not in any way a recruiter or a proselytizer for the way that I think. I'm very glad for people who can write in the abstract. I've been reading Hegel's lectures on aesthetics lately, where Hegel has written all these lectures on poetry, architecture, art, music, and I'm so glad to read them, and they are so beautiful. Partly the reason why I think I can understand them is that he didn't write them. His students who had sat through his lectures gathered their notes and his notes and compiled them after he died. And of anything that I've tried to wade through from Hegel, those lectures on aesthetics, lectures on art are the easiest or the most comprehensible. And when I realized how they'd been put together, I thought, that's exactly why. So I'm like those students. So, I'm very glad for Hegel. I just can't understand him.
Fair. You're not alone. Loneliness there. Yeah. Well, maybe one more, and then we could move on and have you share a poem. But that point there, I think, about the Matt's question about the abstract and your exhortation to maybe realize that it's always going to be kind of specific and of the moment and personal, ties in here with a question from Sherry. And also from David. I want to kind of combine these two questions to wrap up with. But, Sherry's wondering about, do you think that we struggle to share our stories truthfully because we struggle to be true to ourselves? Again, very specific, kind of rootedness sort of idea there. Like, you think there's a connection there about, telling a true story? How true can you tell that story, when you're not maybe true with yourself? And then to bring it back maybe also to this topic of our future here in America, David sort of asking generally, what hope you have for maybe America to be able to tell more truthful stories?
Well, is it Sherry? It was the first?
Sherry, yes.
Sherry. Yeah. Partly, I suppose, I think of this book in the shelter, it comes from a practice that I've had for a long time at the start of the day to say hello to whatever I know is coming in the day. Hello to that phone call I don't want to make. Hello to that test result that I'm dreading. Hello to the thing I think is going to be lovely. And partly by saying hello, I'm creating a little bit of distance from it. I think all the therapeutic and spiritual practices of the world have a way within which you're encouraged to name something, but in so doing create a distance. If I think what's going to happen at lunchtime is going to be the absolute pinnacle of the day and the rest of the day will go brilliantly because of the news I'm going to get at lunchtime, and then the news comes at lunchtime and it's mediocre, and is my day wrecked? What power have I given the news? And one of the things that is the possibility for speaking about our hopes and our disappointments and creating another self with whom we're in conversation to say, I think this is going to be beautiful, or I think this is going to be terrible, and to have those kinds of conversations. And I think the possibility of saying, oh, I thought that reunion from school was going to be the most joyous thing ever, and actually I came away feeling a little bit sad. What do you do with that? And the first place to tell that story is to yourself. And I think when we can realize that those are interesting stories, then there might be the possibility of feeling confident to share them. Because if it's happened to you, it's probably happened to other people too. And that can seem like vulnerability. But if you're in the habit of telling your own stories of sometimes disappointment, sometimes surprise and elation to yourself, well, then actually it mightn't even feel like courage or vulnerability. It might go, this is what it means to be alive. I thought this was going to happen and it didn't. Instead, something else did. And that, I think, is a really important thing. And it can really help. People tell me all the time, my God, you're brave for telling those stories. And I don't think I am. I think I'm a person who lives with fear and worry sometimes. But I suppose I've gotten used to thinking, I think lots of other people do too. So it's worthwhile telling the story. And people come up and then tell you their own stories back.
Mm.
And what was Dave's question then?
Well, I think it was several people here have asked, and David put it this way, how hopeful are you for our future? Maybe especially, because of the ability to maybe not be so truthful in the social media landscape, but you sound like somebody who's hopeful about life.
Well, I need to be, because otherwise, we are abandoning the possibility of change. And what we know is that change can happen. I mean, for God's sake, COVID is a demonstration that the human community can change. And I'm not saying that is a good thing. You can see all kinds of ways where in the last 12 months, all kinds of things have changed very rapidly. I do hold out hope. I think I have never lived in the States, and I don't want to be a person who's not from there, kind of diagnosing America. We have enough Americans diagnosing Ireland without Irish people diagnosing America back. So I'm cautious about ever saying that. But, I see movements like Black Lives Matter and see the extraordinary public truth-telling that they are doing. And I take such courage from that. I read a lot of poetry in preparation for every season of Poetry Unbound. And I see the continued tradition of poets engaging with the public quality of words. And that is alive and well and vibrant in the United States. I read American Poetry Review and the Cortland Review, and read a lot of American poetry journals. And they are filled with people who are using language in a way that's very moving. I think the overwhelming response to Amanda Gorman at the inauguration is demonstrable evidence of the hunger for language of substance in public. And that is meaningful. I have read Truth and Reconciliation reports from various countries, Kenya, South Africa, elements of some situations like that in Ireland. If I were to be given one wish in the world, I would wish that all the European empires would enact truth commissions about the impact of their empires. Because what you have in the United States today is a long debt of Europe for the whole European project of enslavement that birthed the imagination of white economics in the United States. And I would hope that countries could be simply truthful enough to say, let's look at that brutal past, because it's surely, be to God, going to be better to look at it than to deny it, because it is powerful. I know that there are calls and some commitments from American politicians and civil society organizations to putting together a truth commission about enslavement and the entire project of that. And I think that would be very exciting to see the ways within which lament and pain and truth and survival and recognition could come about as a result of that. No commission will ever be perfect. And ultimately, every conflict takes as long to de-escalate as it took to escalate. So in a certain sense, I would think that if there was to be a commission on the economics of enslavement in the United States and the practice of it, that commission would need to meet every 10 years until such time as enslavement had been outlawed for as long as it had been in the statute books. So no year-long event will be sufficient, but it could put some interesting things in the public realm, which are already there, which is a terrible thing, but there is resistance. Will a commission do anything about that? I don't know. I would hope so. I would hope that some people would pay attention and would begin to recognize the impact of generations upon generations of indigenous genocide, as well as then enslavement of African people, and the way that that's continued on. And I think in poetry, in public language, and in policy, there is the possibility of that kind of reckoning, which gives me heart.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, there's so much work to be done, but I hear you. Yeah, it's good work. It's hopeful. It's language work for all of us.
Yeah.
You read us a very lovely narrative piece a while ago. Will you end us now with one of your poems?
Yeah, it does link actually. Let me see, where is it? This poem is called Narrative Theology, number 1.
Thanks.
And I said to him, "Are there answers to all of this?" And he said, "The answer is in a story, and the story is being told." And I said, "But there is so much pain." And she answered plainly, "Pain will happen." Then I said, "Will I ever find meaning?" And they said, "You will find meaning where you give meaning. The answer is in a story, and the story isn't finished."
Pádraig Tuama, thank you for your words. Thank you for being here. We'll leave some comments, or we'll leave links in the comment section after this is over. So all of our audience can find your book, find their way to On Being if they haven't found their way there before. But we'll continue to spread the word. Thank you for sharing your words, your time, your spirit with us.
Oh, my pleasure. This book is being launched on Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. So I'll put a link into that.
Please do. Yep. Yeah.
Into the chat.
We'll get those out. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Be well. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.